On a dark, wet and rainy morning, a woman called Mizuki wakes up when her touchscreen phone buzzes and gets herself ready, dressing up in colorful neon clothing and heads out to the streets for work. Mizuki is a food carrier, delivers fast food from various food spots to customers who've ordered what they desire and rides a hover scooter to get her from a to B. She heads to an apartment block to give a delivery of tempura to number 278. The hallways were quite rundown and the power fluctuated. When she reached number 278 she buzzed the doorbell. No answer, and then she realized the door was open. She decided to enter in. She carefully walked into the apartment and saw what seemed to be a murder. The person she was delivering to was dead on the floor in front of the television and was lying in a pool of blood. More sinisterly was that the person was mauled to death by some kind of animal, and she started to get worried. Then she heard a banging sound coming from the bedroom. She called out who it was, and yet nothing came out of the bedroom. She slowly walked to it and opened the door. She was then aghast at what she witnessed. A roughly shaped humanoid was munching on what seemed to be human remains, and then it turned to her. She panicked and quickly got out the apartment. She raced through the hallways with an animalistic grunting sound tailing her. She reached the back alley where her hover scooter was parked, and before she can get on, the humanoid tackled her down onto the concrete. She screamed as the humanoid was going to lay into her with its teeth, and then shout came from the darkness. A flashing light came out of the shadows and a man in a cream linen suit appeared out. The humanoid gave a growl to the man, and in return he brought out a piece of meat. It crept like a chimpanzee towards him and snatched the meat out his hand. He just stared at it, full of confidence, and then lured it to go and follow him. He quickly turned her and quietly told her to go. She did and drove off on her hover scooter. As she drove on, she kept thinking about that man in the cream and those humanoids. She kept the thoughts to herself and continued on with her work. Chikyu 2 was a planet that humans came to as a secondary Earth and is home to the Japanese population. During the 22nd century, Earth's most populated countries such as China, India, Indonesia and the United States were forced to evacuate their home planet due to the increased domination of a warmonger race that they call the invaders. Using all of NASA's supplies, they accidentally flown through a wormhole near Jupiter's orbit and ended up in a totally different galaxy. Scientists are unsure how this wormhole came into being, but what did was to let each heavily populated country have a barren planet for themselves. Dikyu 2, Bhumi 2 and Prithvi 2 amongst others. Chikyu 2 has the advanced technologies that the Japanese were creating and still do, advancing and creating more out there designs, used for produce, commercialism and hierarchy. It still carries its history from centuries ago, but with a more neon twist. Fast forward to 3 years later, Mizuki woke up in her apartment when her touchscreen phone buzzed. She turned next to her right side. A man was sleeping next to her, and then she stood up on the bed. She started to playfully stamp her bare feet onto his face to wake him up. He grunted and grabbed his pillow to cover his head. She decided to leave him in bed as she had to go to work and said to him that the keycard will be on the coffee table. She went out and closed the door behind. She continued on with her deliveries and finished at some time after her shift. She returned to her apartment. When she took the lift and reached the floor where her apartment was, the corridors were sealed off with laser tapes. She knew that the authorities were about because of the technology they used, and then an officer came to her. She said she lived at the number 808, and then the officer had given her some terrible news. Her boyfriend Yuto was mutilated and killed in her apartment. Her tears spread her face and tried to hold in the news she was given. A while later, Yuto's body was taken out of the apartment block and Mizuki was let back into her apartment after it was cleaned up. She went in and was down because of this discovery. She took a shower to ease her mind a little bit. After she came out, she heard some footsteps and carefully leaned through the bathroom door. She was then taken aback when she noticed the man in the cream linen suit she met 3 years prior and opened the door. The man turned to her and said it was another attack. She said, "Is it from those humanoids?" and the man said yes. She curiously asked him if they had a name, and the man said they're strangely called weevils. The man then introduces himself as the doctor, and she had heard of the name as a sort of bedtime story character. The doctor just sniffed at this and says at least there's no fanboys nor fangirls trying to rip the material off his clothes. She just gave a little grin to him and says she wants to assist him. The doctor told her no and that he'll handle this situation himself. The authorities will follow false trails and not get to the truth. She wanted to come and then grabbed a pair of scissors nearby the sink. She pointed them to his face and told him she'll come with him. She wanted to avenge Yuto's death and that those memories of that brief encounter they met still lingered in her mind. The doctor reluctantly agreed to this arrangement and said they'll have to look into the back streets, every nook and cranny in order to find where the weevils are lurking. She agreed and went to get dressed. The doctor and Mizuki headed to one of the back alleys where they then encounter a junkie screaming covered in blood. The doctor questioned him and asked what happened. The junkie called Daku saw a group of weevils ravaged two of his friends and disappeared into the sewers. The doctor then told Daku to show him one of the sewer entrances, but Daku then brought something out his pocket and it was a small empty syringe with what seemed to be drained dark red fluid. Daku proposed an offer. He wanted some more NAS in order to help the two, but the doctor rebuffed this and said he's not supplying futuristic smack in order to get to a serious matter. Daku didn't believe a word that came out of the doctor's mouth and began to get a bit aggressive towards him. The doctor stared at him and then a small idea came into his head. Daku was then hung upside down at the sewer entrance with the doctor and Mizuki holding him by his legs. They were using Daku as bait for the weevils. Daku shouted for help and the doctor told him to be quiet. Then a bunch of weevils came out of the darkness and quickly grabbed Daku. He screamed and they headed off back to the dark with him in tow. Mizuki turned to the doctor and said what happens next. He says to her they follow them and see what the weevils hideout is all about. She was bit unsure about it, but the doctor says if she wants to find the truth of Yuto's death and head into the belly of the beast. The two headed through the pipes. It smelled damp and a little rats with white fur tufts emerged from left to right. Then there was a wave of growing and grunting. The doctor stopped and then creeped across to the end of the pipe. He looked on at a shantytown community filled with weevils and Mizuki looked over at where Daku was. He was getting ripped apart by a bunch of them. She looked away at the sight and then the doctor held her hand. Then the weevils started to move like the parting sea and a man in a long black coat walks in. Mizuki recognized him. He was called Kuragari, an ex-member of the Yakuza, and was presumed missing for a few years since he was targeted for assassination. The doctor was trying to suss out why does an ex-Yakuza and weevils have to do with it. Suddenly the doctor accidentally fell down from the sewage pipe and lands hard down to the ground. The weevils jolted and surround him like caged animals. Kuragari brought out a leather whip and started whacking it around to keep the weevils stable. The doctor then got up and asked him how did he acquire the weevils. Kuragari said it was a sort immigration phase that the Yakuza conducted and that the weevils were originally intended to be sparring opponents for entertainment and money. When an assassination attempt was claimed on his life, he fled underground along with the remaining surviving weevils due to a vast majority of them were killed by assassins and the other members of the Yakuza. He created this little army to take down the ones who wanted to kill him and mentions ones that Mizuki had accidentally encountered. The man in apartment 278 and her boyfriend Yuto. The doctor says to him that killing them as they were sorta involved with his assassination attempt and that murdering them will do any good for his life even if it'll cut short when the time comes. Kuragari started to violently whip the weevils into place and ordered them to kill the doctor. The doctor just stared at them and then the weevils began to turn on Kuragari. He ordered them to stop but it didn't work and they savagely mutilate him. The doctor quickly moved away from the massacre and climbed back up to the sewage pipe. Mizuki waited for him. He told her to head to the surface and she said what he was going to do. He was going to enclose the sewage pipe so that weevils can't get to the surface. He didn't want them to get captured and be executed. They were the last of their remaining species and keeping hidden from anyone is the only solution. She agreed to this and quickly headed back up to higher ground. The ground then rumbled and a large blast erupted from behind her. She reached the back alley they came from and looked around for the doctor to emerge but he didn't. In her mind the doctor sacrificed himself and died in that explosion to keep the weevils from reaching the surface. A few days later Mizuki was back doing her deliveries and as she was passing she saw a blue police box in an alleyway. She stopped and headed towards it. The box hummed and she touched its exterior. Suddenly she heard some whistling coming from behind her and she quickly hid behind a dumpster. She peered around and saw the doctor walking to the blue box. He did survive the explosion. She watched him enter in and saw it fade away with a wheezing groaning in its wake. She emerged from behind the dumpster and looked up at the sky. Who was the doctor? Who on earth was that man?